Ahoy! A lot of you may already know that New World's combat code is getting rewritten, but there's a lot of additional information that we have about how things in New World work when it comes to the tech side of things and what they're working on in terms of improvements. And I think that's very interesting, especially because the devs currently kind of seem to be changing direction. So first off, if you haven't heard this yet, Delacron confirmed that their combat code is being completely rewritten for better flexibility, stability and performance, especially with client memory, and they will be sharing details for a PTR test within the next few weeks. And this by itself is obviously huge already, because entirely rewriting the combat code of a game is not a small task. And while we don't have insight into the exact steps here, my assumption is that this will definitely be a major factor, especially for larger scale PvP, because that is where we have more performance issues with combat. If you go into very small scale PvP, for example, the new 3v3 arena, the performance issues are much smaller in comparison. So very excited to see what's going to happen there. And Delacron has also confirmed that this should help with desync. The devs told us a little bit more about desync and how it happens now. So there are different forms of desync in terms of combat that happen in different ways. The first one is if you kind of see an animation reset. This isn't necessarily a bug, this can be a rollback to kind of sync things up. And likewise, if your position or the position of an ability especially is moving, then this is a server correction. The server is correcting the position to kind of match between other clients' information and your own client's information and what the server itself has as information, so that things kind of line up between those. And essentially, in general, the servers and the clients need to double check with each other as to what exactly is going on and what the player is seeing. One of the worst case scenarios that I've described here is that you swing and something from off screen hits you and your attack animation gets reset from this hit while you're already in the middle of the swing on your own screen. But on a larger scale, the devs say that so far they have been kind of catching up with industry standards when it comes to what they're prioritizing, and have been cramming in a lot of features that other games already have and that they are kind of expected to have. So now that they're mostly done with that, they'll be able to focus more on optimization. And for a long time they had to decide between making a feature, fixing a bug, or optimizing. So far the focus has been making the features. And obviously doing the whole combat overhaul is one of the first big steps to this optimization, so we can kind of see this in action relatively soon. If you enjoyed the video so far, consider subscribing, and if you want to chat with me directly and ask me a question, then consider supporting me on Patreon. There are also good reasons why New World has certain performance issues. So for example, if you think of OPR or elite chest runs and the stutters that you can often experience while doing those, that is because there are a lot of interactions going on behind the scenes. So packets are being sent and forth between the client, the player, and the server, and that gets basically checked back and forth. But the amount of this is actually insane. So they said that depending on the density, for example in a war, you could have up to 6,000 spells and projectiles per minute that all need to be created and destroyed again, which requires a lot of resources, and obviously player data being sent along with that between players as well, which leads to performance problems in areas with high density, which makes it kind of funny looking back that when the game came out, the claim was that they could support much larger fights, which was never gonna happen, I guess. And also there is a clear statement from the devs here that New World's combat in general is very server heavy, so a lot has to bounce back and forth, which I guess is good in a way, because otherwise you'd have more load on the individual PCs. And also obviously if you could manipulate too many things client side, that can lead to problems as well, which we had more issues with in the early days when people from regions with higher ping actually had an advantage sometimes. Character models in New World also have different hitboxes for headshots, arms, legs and so on, which obviously factors into these resource requirements as well, and they specifically pointed out that they have headshot effects and leg shot effects. Maybe there's an ability that is slipping my mind, but as far as I recall there isn't any leg shot effect anymore at this point. There used to be, but I don't think we have any anymore. But maybe I'm forgetting something. I'm wondering if they could actually dial that down a bit and just say, okay, we have a headbox and then we have a body and that's all we need, because I don't think the others are really used for anything, and I'm not sure how it would be beneficial. But obviously you don't want to have the body just be a single box as well, because that would just make it more annoying. You could have more hits that hit you, connect to you, while they shouldn't really, because you're just, you know, getting an arrow that goes right past your leg or something, but then arrow hitboxes are a different conversation anyways. The dev team also have test bots that they use to try and simulate what players are doing for their tests, in order to get a good idea of how something will perform, like for example a world boss event. This is however very difficult because players are very hard to predict, resulting in the actual performance that they get at certain things not lining up with the tests that they did. Especially things like open world bosses that have no limit of players essentially are very hard to predict in that regard. There are mitigation systems for this world boss lag, for example, to not affect players in the same hub, quote unquote. So other people that are doing other things that are nearby, they should have a comparatively smooth experience, but the area where a lot of players are in is going to be affected, of course. The influence races are another example of where performance issues are kind of a limitation to some degree. So they took the player mechanic from fort capture, where you basically only have a certain number of players allowed in a specific area and only a certain number of various factions, and then they translated that over to all the small towers. Now there is a problem with that the devs recently talked about in another show, being that if there are two factions fighting over a point and a third faction tries to get in, the third faction can basically not reach the same numbers if the point is already crowded, because there's kind of some leeway for the first two factions that are on there to fight in larger numbers and get closer to the overall cap. So if the third one then comes in, they kind of just have a higher chance to get teleported out, even if there are less people, which I think is a very frustrating mechanic, but that allows them to kind of have larger scale fights in certain areas. It just becomes kind of messy if you actually have three factions fighting over the same area. They say they need these kinds of measures because PvP is just a lot more performance sensitive. They also have other measures in other open world areas though, like obviously they have the teleports, but then they, for example, also have a physical barrier where you just cannot enter the area. There's just an invisible wall. One example for that was wars back in the day when they were fought in the open world. Wars are now instance, that's one of the upgrades they did, but I recently experienced one of these walls anyways, because on one of the PTR tests when the mounts were first released, people couldn't get into the area for the mount quest because there were just too many people trying at once, which was kind of funny. Unfortunately, the cost of rendering the world sometimes goes over the resource budget, especially with world bosses, because the resource budget in New World is already quite tight when the maps were designed, essentially. And if you add a world boss on top of that, that's a lot more assets and everything that needs to be loaded in it that can affect the performance as well. They're working on optimizing that, for example, by just removing some stuff outright. And also one issue that can come with that is that sometimes AI will have spawn delays due to this. We got some information about the Season Pass bug. This was caused by code refactoring, so they were restructuring some of the code, and unfortunately that led to some brand new issues. They talked about that a little bit more, but really not getting anything new out of that. I think it's just the issue existed and they did everything to fix it. And one of the things that kind of came up in that context were the make good systems, which have improved since launch. So they have much better means of tracking who is experiencing an issue and how they can compensate them and so on now, which is obviously useful. And on the topic of better systems that they have now as well, there's also the red button. So this allows them to shut off specific aspects of the game without affecting all of it. For example, instead of turning off all player trade when an issue arises there, they're able to just turn off player-to-player trade and leaving other ones active. Or they can disable specific items or specific abilities, as they did recently. So that gives them a lot more control instead of disabling major systems in the game, and I think that's a very good system to have. Now in terms of how they use resources, Delacon made some additional statements which I thought were very interesting. It seems like they were removed, I was not able to find them, but they are still findable through Jay Oddity's channel, so credit to him here. That's where these screenshots come from. Delacon said, there are macro and micro leadership decisions, but our studio is fairly independent with what and how our resources are used. For now there is no Lord of the Rings without New World, and New World is very much still near everyone's core focus across our studio. He further cemented that by saying that Lord of the Rings is very much in early stages and saying that the team is something like 5 people right now. Somebody suggested that New World could die off and it wouldn't really hurt Amazon at all, but Delacon said, possible, but Amazon Games are still very much invested in New World's future. Our team has had no layoffs since launch, despite wider reorganization across the company. Remember, there are many other areas in the company that had significant layoffs, and they have a full roadmap years out planned to degrees of detail that they haven't shared yet. So lots of content coming up still, and plus, as mentioned above, the studio is also responsible for developing the new Lord of the Rings MMO, which is years away from shipping. So I think this is very interesting in the context of this whole tech improvement stuff. It very much feels to me like the team that is responsible for a lot of the tech side, the improvements, the functionality side of thing will strongly overlap between New World and Lord of the Rings, which again, it's the same engine. It makes a lot of sense that they are preparing a lot of these systems in New World and then utilize them in Lord of the Rings as well. And that's going to be interesting in terms of what that means for the team later on, of course, but they also said that it's years away from shipping. I very much believe that New World's continuation is somewhat necessary for Lord of the Rings success. Again, I think in very many ways, New World is the testing ground here, and this kind of confirms this further. What doesn't mention is, of course, the pace. I very, very strongly believe that the team working on New World is, by the games industry standards, relatively small, and I think that's why content is coming out at a relatively slow rate, so even though they have a lot of things planned, they're not coming fast. I've got another video talking about that in more detail, so if you're interested in that, you can check that out right here. Other than that, again, if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. And if you'd like to support me further and be able to chat with me on Discord and stuff, then consider doing so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. SLOTH out.